The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office hummed like dying wasps as Lora sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like a prayer she'd forgotten how to finish. The plastic surgeon's gloved fingers traced the constellation of scars across her left shoulder blade, each touch a whisper of memory she'd spent 15 years trying to silence. 47 wounds, he'd said. 47 deliberate punctures that had somehow been dismissed as sibling rivalry by parents who chose blindness over truth. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. How long did you say these were untreated? Dr. Martinez asked, his voice carrying that careful neutrality medical professionals perfected when confronting the unthinkable. His office smelled of antiseptic and expensive leather, a stark contrast to the cramped bedroom where the attacks had happened, where twin beds sat 3 feet apart like opposing armies in an endless war. 6 months, Lora whispered, though. The number felt inadequate. 6 months of infections that bloomed like poisonous flowers beneath her school uniforms. 6 months of her mother applying Neosporin with the same casual efficiency she used to butter toast, as if puncture wounds were as common as scraped knees. My parents said. They said kids heal fast. The plastic surgeon's pen scratched against his notepad with the sound of tiny claws. Behind him, his diplomas hung in perfect alignment. Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins residency, certifications in reconstructive surgery, a wall of achievements that seemed to mock the adults who had failed so spectacularly in their most basic duty. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline stretched endlessly, glass towers reaching toward clouds that promised rain but never delivered relief. Lora's fingers found the raised scar along her collarbone, a habit she'd developed over the years like a rosary of trauma. The wound had been deeper than the others, requiring 17 stitches that her parents had finally, reluctantly allowed. But only after Mrs. Henderson next door had threatened to call Child Protective Services when she noticed Lora washing blood from her school clothes in the backyard sprinkler system. Tell me about the scissors, Dr. Martinez said, settling back in his chair. His voice held no judgment, only the patient curiosity of someone who had seen humanity's capacity for both healing and harm. Were they the same pair each time, though? Question transported Lora back to the yellow-handled craft scissors that had lived in the cup holder on Lora's desk. Innocent tools meant for construction paper and school projects, transformed into instruments of systematic torment. Lora had been left-handed, which meant the wounds always came from unexpected angles. Lora had learned to sleep on her stomach, arms tucked beneath her pillow, but even unconsciousness couldn't protect her from her twins' creative interpretations of sibling conflict. Yellow handles, Lora said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. They were supposed to be safety scissors, the kind they give to kindergartners. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. Safety scissors that had made her feel anything but safe in her own home, in her own bed, in her own skin. Dr. Martinez nodded, making another note. The afternoon light filtering through his windows caught the silver in his hair, and Lora found herself wondering if he had children, if he went home to a house where siblings played board games instead of conducting medical experiments on each other's flesh. And your parents' response when you reported these incidents? They said twins fight differently. The words came automatically, a practiced response that had been drilled into her consciousness through years of repetition. That Lora was just expressing frustration, that I was being dramatic. She paused, remembering the way her mother's lips would purse when Lora appeared in the kitchen with fresh bandages, as if the wounds were an inconvenience rather than evidence of something deeply wrong. The plastic surgeon's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of professional outrage carefully contained. He had spent decades rebuilding faces shattered by accidents, reconstructing bodies damaged by disease. But there was something uniquely disturbing about injuries inflicted by someone who shared your DNA, your bedroom, Your birth date. Lora, he said, leaning forward slightly. I need you to understand that what happened to you wasn't normal sibling rivalry. These wounds show patterns of premeditation. The spacing, the depth variations, the way they avoided major blood vessels. This suggests someone who took time to consider placement and impact. The room seemed to contract around those words. Premeditation. The clinical term for what Lora had always known but never had language to express. That Lora's attacks weren't crimes of passion, but calculated cruelty. She remembered lying in the dark, listening to the sound of Lora sharpening the scissors against her desk drawer, the metal-on-wood scraping that had become her nightly lullaby of fear. I kept a calendar, Lora admitted, the confession tumbling out before she could stop it. Hidden in my math textbook. I marked the dates, tried to find a pattern. Thought maybe if I figured out when she'd be angry, I could protect myself better. Dr. Martinez set down his pen entirely, giving her his full attention. And did you find a pattern? Every 10 days, roughly. Sometimes 8, sometimes 12, but usually around 10. The statistics rolled off her tongue like prayer beads worn smooth by repetition. Except during her period. Then it was every day for a week. Lora had never told anyone about the calendar, about the way she'd color-coded the attacks by severity. Yellow for surface wounds, orange for deeper cuts, red for the times she'd nearly passed out from blood loss. The silence that followed felt heavy with understanding. Dr. Martinez had treated enough victims of domestic violence to recognize the hypervigilance, the careful cataloging of abuse patterns that survivors developed as psychological armor. But those cases usually involved adults harming children, or partners hurting each other. Twin-on-twin violence at this level of sophistication was rare enough to warrant case studies. "Where is Lora now?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Medical school, Johns Hopkins." Lora's laugh held no humor. "She's studying pediatrics, wants to help children." The irony was so sharp it could cut, Lora channeling her intimate knowledge of inflicting pain into a career dedicated to healing, as if the Hippocratic Oath could somehow absolve her of sins committed with safety scissors in a shared bedroom. Doctor. Martinez made another note, this one longer, more urgent. "Have you considered that your parents might not have been willfully neglectful? Sometimes when abuse occurs within families, especially between children, adults convince themselves they're witnessing normal development rather than pathological behavior. It's a form of psychological protection." But Lora shook her head, remembering the way her father had actually laughed when she'd shown him the puncture wound that had gone through her shoulder blade and nicked her lung. "Girls will be girls," he'd said, ruffling Lora's hair while Lora struggled to breathe properly. "Your sister's just spirited, as if systematic torture was a personality quirk to be celebrated rather than a red flag demanding intervention. As if the 47 wounds scattered across Lora's back, shoulders, and arms were evidence of creativity rather than cruelty. The appointment was supposed to be about reconstructive options, laser treatments, dermabrasion, surgical revision of the worst scars. But sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, bathed in the harsh honesty of fluorescent lighting, Lora realized she had come seeking something else entirely. Validation. Witness. Someone with medical credentials to look at the evidence carved into her skin and confirm what she had always known but never been allowed to say. This was not normal. This was not okay. This was not her fault. "I want to show you something," Dr. Martinez said, moving to his computer. The screen filled with medical photographs, other cases, other patients, other stories of survival written in scar tissue. "These are defensive wounds," he said, pointing to a series of cuts along forearms. "And these are accidental injuries from craft activities." Another click, another set of images. "And these..." The final photographs made Lora's breath catch. The pattern was unmistakable, deliberate, methodical, designed for maximum psychological impact while avoiding life-threatening damage. These are from another case I consulted on 5 years ago. The perpetrator was eventually diagnosed with conduct disorder evolving into antisocial personality disorder. The victim, the twin brother, required extensive therapy but has made a full recovery, both physical and psychological. The words hung in the air like a bridge between past trauma and future healing. Another twin. Another case of systematic sibling abuse dismissed by well-meaning adults who couldn't fathom the darkness that could exist in a child's heart. Another survivor who had carried their scars into adulthood, seeking reconstruction not just of damaged skin, but of damaged trust, damaged safety, damaged sense of self. The good news, Dr. Martinez continued, is that we can address most of these scars. The bad news is that the deepest healing you need isn't something I can provide with a scalpel. As if summoned by his words, Lora's phone buzzed with a text message. The name on the screen made her blood freeze. Lora, twin sister, future pediatrician. Current medical student who had spent their shared childhood turning Lora's body into a teaching tool for cruelty. Heard you're seeing a plastic surgeon, the message read. Mom told me. Hope you're not planning to erase all our shared memories. Some scars are meant to be permanent. See you at Christmas. The heart emoji felt like mockery, a digital recreation of the twisted affection Lora had always claimed to feel, even as she wielded scissors like paintbrushes, creating masterpieces of pain across her twin's unwilling canvas. Dr. Martinez must have seen something in Lora's expression because he leaned forward, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. Lora? Are you all right? But she wasn't. All right. She hadn't been all right for 15 years, not since the first time Lora had convinced their parents that puncture wounds were just part of growing up as twins. And sitting in this sterile office, surrounded by the tools and knowledge that could rebuild her skin but not her shattered sense of safety, Lora realized that the real question wasn't whether she was all right. The real question was whether she was finally ready to stop pretending that she was. Lora's apartment existed in the space between healing and haunting. A converted loft in Seattle's Capitol Hill district where exposed brick walls displayed her photography like evidence in a case she was still building against her past. Each morning began the same way: shower with the bathroom door locked, mirror consultation to catalog which scars were visible above her carefully chosen necklines, and the ritual application of concealer that had become as automatic as breathing. The routine held her together like medical tape over a wound that refused to heal properly. Coffee at exactly 6:47 a.m., black with 1 sugar cube, never 2, never none, because predictability was armor against chaos. Toast cut into triangles because Lora had always preferred squares, and even 15 years later, Lora chose opposition as a form of silent rebellion. The apartment smelled like lavender and developing chemicals, scents she had curated to overwrite the memory of antiseptic and fear that had defined her childhood bedroom. Her photography studio occupied the eastern corner, where morning light transformed her latest project into something approaching art. The series was called Healing in Plain Sight, portraits of survivors whose scars told stories society preferred to keep hidden. Mrs. Chen, whose arms bore the raised keloids of childhood burns inflicted by an older brother who thought fire was funny. Marcus, whose back displayed the geometric precision of his stepfather's belt buckle. And now, Lora's own reflection in the camera lens, preparing to document the constellation of puncture wounds that had shaped her understanding of love, family, and the thin line between protection and harm. The camera never lied, which was both its blessing and its curse. Through the lens, Lora could see what others missed: the way trauma rewrote posture, the hypervigilance that made survivors' eyes dart toward exits, the careful way they positioned their bodies to protect vulnerable spaces. She had turned her own hyper-awareness into a superpower of sorts, reading the hidden stories written in strangers' shoulders, the defensive gestures that spoke of histories better left unexamined. But the camera also captured what she wished it wouldn't. The way her left shoulder sat slightly higher than her right, a permanent adjustment to protect the deepest scars. The unconscious way her hand drifted to her collarbone when she was nervous, tracing the raised line of tissue where Lora's creativity had nearly nicked her carotid artery. The fact that even in her own space, surrounded by her own choices, she still slept on her stomach with her arms tucked protectively beneath her pillow. Her phone rang at 9:23 a.m., earlier than usual for her mother's weekly check-in. The timing felt ominous, like storm clouds gathering on an otherwise clear day. Lora considered letting it go to voicemail, but 15 years of conditioning were hard to break. Children of neglectful parents learn to answer every call, terrified that the one time they didn't might be the one time their parents actually needed them. "Lora, honey, I heard you saw Dr. Martinez yesterday." Her mother's voice carried that particular blend of concern and irritation that Lora remembered from childhood, the tone reserved for scraped knees, failed tests, and apparently, consultations. About reconstructive surgery for childhood abuse. "You know you don't need to do anything drastic. Those little marks barely show anymore." Little marks. 47 puncture wounds had been reduced to little marks in the same way that systematic torture had been rebranded as sibling rivalry. Lora's reflection in her studio mirror told a different story. Raised keloids along her shoulder blade where infection had set in. A spider web of white lines across her upper arm, where Lora had tested different angles of approach. The puckered scar near her spine where a particularly deep wound had required emergency room treatment that her parents had reluctantly allowed only after the school nurse had threatened legal intervention. "I'm exploring my options, Mom." Lora kept her voice carefully neutral, a skill she'd developed alongside her hypervigilance. "Dr. Martinez thinks some of the scarring can be improved. But why spend the money? You know, Lora didn't mean any real harm. She was just expressive, and you were so sensitive about everything." The words arrived with the casual cruelty of long practice, dismissing decades of pain with the efficiency of a bureaucrat stamping rejected applications. Besides, think about how this might affect Lora's career. She's applying for residency programs. They do background checks these days. There it was, the familiar inversion of reality where Lora's healing became a threat to Lora's success, where the victim's recovery was positioned as an act of aggression against the perpetrator's future. Her mother had perfected this particular form of gaslighting, turning cause and effect inside out, until Lora questioned her own memories, her own scars, her own right to seek treatment for injuries that had been dismissed as character flaws. "Lora's career isn't my responsibility," Lora said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Through her studio window, she could see her neighbor Mrs. Park tending to her rooftop garden, carefully pruning damaged branches to allow for new growth, a metaphor so obvious it made her chest tight with longing. Her mother's sigh carried 15 years of practiced martyrdom. "I just don't understand why you can't let the past be the past. Lora's doing so well now. She volunteers at the children's hospital. She's top of her class. She sends me such sweet texts about how much she misses home. She's grown into such a caring person." The disconnect was so profound it felt like cognitive whiplash. Lora's caring nature, apparently, extended to everyone except the twin sister, whose body she had used for target practice throughout their shared childhood. Lora wondered if her mother genuinely couldn't see the contradiction, or if willful blindness had become such a comfortable habit that acknowledging the truth would require reconstructing her entire understanding of their family dynamic. "I have to go, Mom. I have a client coming in." The lie slipped out easily, another survival skill perfected through years of necessity. Her actual morning was empty except for her photography, and the growing stack of research about sibling abuse, trauma recovery, and the long-term effects of childhood neglect by caregivers who should have protected instead of enabled. After hanging Up, Lora pulled out her laptop and opened the document she'd been working on for months, a timeline of every incident she could remember, cross-referenced with her hidden calendar from childhood and supplemented by medical records she'd finally requested from their family doctor. The pattern that emerged was damning in its consistency: escalating attacks, increasing sophistication in wound placement, and a disturbing evolution from impulsive violence to calculated cruelty. The earliest entry was from age 7, when Lora had accidentally stabbed her with a pencil during homework time. Their father had laughed it off as typical twin competitiveness, even as Lora's hand bled graphite-black tears onto her math worksheet. The incident had established the template for everything that followed. Lora's tears, claims of accident, and their parents' eager acceptance of any explanation that didn't require uncomfortable questions or difficult interventions. By age 8, the accidents had become more frequent and creative. Scissors during craft time, compass points during geometry lessons, safety pins during clothing repairs. Each incident carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous while systematically teaching Lora that her body belonged not to her, but to her twin's experimental curiosity. Lora had been conducting a long-term study in pain tolerance, using her identical genetic material as a control group in an experiment no ethics board would ever approve. The timeline revealed something else disturbing. The attacks had always intensified during periods when Lora received positive attention. Report card day, when Lora's straight A's overshadowed Lora's B+ average. The morning after Lora's photography won the school art contest. The week when their grandmother had praised Lora's kindness while criticizing Lora's tendency towards selfishness. Each wound had been a correction, a punishment for the crime of being perceived as better, different, or more deserving of love. Lora's fingers found her collarbone scar again, tracing the raised tissue while her mind drifted to the afternoon. It had happened. She'd been 14, newly accepted into the advanced photography program at their high school. Lora had spent the morning in forced congratulations, smiling with their parents while her eyes promised retribution. That night, she'd waited until Lora was deep in a REM sleep, before testing whether craft scissors could reach bone if applied with sufficient pressure and precision. They couldn't, but the attempt had nicked an artery and sent blood cascading down Lora's neck like scarlet tears. Even then, with their parents driving frantically to the emergency room while Lora held a towel against the spurting wound, Lora had maintained her performance. "I was trying to cut a tag off her pajamas," she'd sobbed to the triage nurse. "I was being helpful. I didn't mean for this to happen." The lie had been so perfectly delivered, so consistent with the established narrative of Lora's good intentions gone wrong, that even the medical staff had accepted it without question. 14-year-old Lora, dizzy from blood loss and anesthesia, had tried to explain that there was no tag, that she'd been asleep, that this was part of a pattern rather than an isolated accident. But her protests had been dismissed as trauma-induced confusion, her accusations labeled as sibling rivalry taken too far. Now, at 29, Lora could see the incident with the clarity that only distance and therapy could provide. Lora had chosen the location carefully, a spot that would bleed dramatically but not kill, creating maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. She had waited for deep sleep to ensure maximum shock and confusion. She had prepared her explanation in advance, complete with tears and remorse that would satisfy their parents' need to believe in her fundamental goodness. It was, Lora realized, the work of someone who understood manipulation at a level that should have been impossible for a 14-year-old. Unless that 14-year-old had been practicing on her twin sister for 7 years, perfecting her techniques and studying the adult's responses, learning exactly how much violence could be packaged as accident before anyone started asking uncomfortable questions. The realization hit her like ice water. Lora hadn't just been abusing her. She had been using Lora's pain as a laboratory for studying human psychology, learning how to inflict maximum damage while maintaining minimum accountability. Every wound had been both an act of cruelty and a lesson in manipulation, teaching. Lora's skills she was now using to charm her way through medical school and into a career where she would have access to vulnerable children. Lora's phone buzzed again, another text from Lora. This one included a photograph. Lora in her white coat, stethoscope around her neck, smiling beside a young patient whose trusting face made Lora's stomach clench with protective fear. The message read, "Little Emma reminds me so much of you at that age. Some kids are just natural helpers. She never complains, even when procedures hurt. Such a brave girl." The subtext was unmistakable. Lora was still studying pain tolerance, still fascinated by victims who suffered in silence, still drawn to the vulnerable and trusting. But now her laboratory was a children's hospital, and her test subjects were patients too sick and scared to question their doctor's unusual interest in their capacity for enduring discomfort without protest. Lora stared at the photo until her vision blurred, seeing not Lora's proud smile but the shadow of the child who had spent 7 years teaching herself the geography of human suffering through systematic experimentation on her twin sister's unwilling flesh. The yellow-handled scissors had been replaced by medical instruments, the shared bedroom transformed into hospital rooms, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Lora's fascination with power over the powerless, her talent for making cruelty look like care. For the first time in 15 years, Lora felt something other than fear when she thought about her twin sister. She felt responsibility, not for her own healing, which had been her focus for so long, but for the children who would cross Lora's path without the benefit of knowing what those gentle hands were capable of when no one was watching. The timeline. On her laptop screen blurred as tears she hadn't expected began to fall. But these weren't tears of self-pity or remembered pain. They were tears of recognition. The moment when a survivor realizes that her story isn't finished, that the wounds carved into her body might serve a purpose beyond personal healing. They might be evidence in a case that could protect others from experiencing the same systematic cruelty she had endured. Lora saved the document with shaking hands, then opened a new file. This one she titled, "For Emma and All the Others." Because sometimes healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about ensuring it couldn't repeat itself in the future. Sometimes the most profound act of recovery was using your scars as a roadmap to prevent others from acquiring their own. The Seattle Children's Hospital lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos of healing in progress, worried parents clutching, coffee cups like talismans, siblings trailing behind with the restless energy of unwilling participants in medical drama, and the ever-present undercurrent of hope wrestling with fear that defined pediatric healthcare. Lora sat in the corner chair she'd claimed for the past 3 days, her camera bag positioned like a shield between herself and the steady stream of white coats that passed through the automatic doors. She had started coming here under the pretense of documentary photography, pitching a series about childhood resilience to the hospital's public relations department. The approval had come with surprising ease. Hospitals loved positive publicity, and Lora's portfolio spoke to her ability to find light in dark places. But her real purpose had nothing to do with inspiration and everything to do with investigation. Somewhere in this building, Lora was completing her pediatric rotation, and Lora needed to see for herself what caring looked like when filtered through the lens of someone who had spent their childhood conducting pain experiments. The first day had yielded nothing but anxiety and the familiar hypervigilance that made her scan every doorway for a face that shared her bone structure. Lora's schedule, according to the casual inquiry Lora had made at the volunteer desk, included rounds in the oncology and trauma units, exactly the places where children would be most vulnerable, most dependent on the adults claiming to heal them. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. Lora had chosen the specialty that gave her maximum access to the young and powerless, while Lora had spent her adult life hiding behind camera lenses, afraid to be seen clearly enough for anyone to notice the damage. On the second day, she had spotted Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the attending physician overseeing Lora's rotation. Dr. Hendricks moved through the hospital with the efficient compassion of someone who had learned to balance empathy with emotional survival, stopping to chat with families, reviewing charts with residents, and maintaining the kind of professional warmth that made children trust her, even when she brought needles and uncomfortable questions. Lora had photographed her from a distance, capturing the unconscious body language of someone who genuinely cared about her patient's well-being. Open posture, eye-level conversations with children, hands that moved to comfort rather than control. The contrast with what Lora remembered of Lora's touch was stark enough to make her question her own memories. Had she misunderstood? Had trauma distorted her recollection of events that might have been less malicious than her wounded psyche had? Painted them? The doubt crept in like fog, obscuring the clarity she'd worked so hard to achieve through therapy and documentation. Maybe their mother was right. Maybe she was being dramatic, seeing pathology where only sibling rivalry had existed. But then she remembered the calendar hidden in her math textbook, the methodical tracking of attacks that had revealed patterns too sophisticated for accidental violence. She remembered the way Lora's eyes had brightened when Lora bled, the careful attention to wound placement that suggested anatomical knowledge beyond a child's normal understanding. Most damning of all, she remembered the aftermath, how Lora had held her while she cried, whispering apologies that felt more like ownership than remorse, promising to be more careful next time instead of promising to stop. On the third day, as if summoned by Lora's mounting internal conflict, Lora appeared in the lobby like a ghost materialized from memory. She moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in medical settings, her white coat pristine and properly fitted, stethoscope draped around her neck like jewelry that proclaimed her belonging. But it was her face that made Lora's breath catch. The same features arranged in the same pattern, but animated by an expression of professional compassion that seemed both genuine and somehow performative, as if Lora had studied videos of caring people and learned to replicate their micro-expressions. Lora paused at the family consultation area, where a mother was crying softly while her husband held a folder thick with medical reports. Their daughter, maybe 8 years old, sat between them with the pallid complexion and bald scalp that spoke of aggressive treatment for aggressive disease. Lora approached them with the practiced grace of someone who had learned that timing, and tone could transform even the most devastating news into something that felt like hope. "Mrs. Patterson?" Lora's voice carried exactly the right blend of authority and warmth. "I'm Dr. Mitchell, one of Dr. Hendricks' residents. I wanted to check in with you about Emma's response to the new treatment protocol." Lora's camera came up automatically, capturing the scene through a telephoto lens that revealed details invisible to casual observers. Lora's hand placement on the mother's shoulder, gentle but somehow territorial. The way she knelt to Emma's eye level while maintaining physical contact that looked comforting but positioned her in control of the child's personal space. The micro-expressions that flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking, analytical, rather than empathetic, as if she were cataloging the family's emotional responses for future reference. "Emma's been so brave through everything," Mrs. Patterson was saying, wiping her eyes with tissues that Lora provided from her coat pocket. "She never complains, even when the procedures hurt. Dr. Mitchell has been wonderful about explaining everything to her in ways she can understand." "Some children have a remarkable tolerance for discomfort," Lora replied, and Lora's blood turned to ice water. The phrasing was too familiar, too reminiscent of the clinical observations Lora used to make during their childhood, noting Lora's capacity for silent suffering as if it were a fascinating medical phenomenon rather than a trauma response to systematic abuse. Through her camera lens, Lora watched Lora's interaction with 8-year-old Emma, looking for signs of the predatory attention she remembered. But what she saw was more subtle and somehow more disturbing, a professional interest that seemed to intensify when Emma showed signs of distress, a tendency to ask follow-up questions about the child's pain tolerance that went beyond standard. Medical inquiry. Laura's hands, when they touched Emma's arm to check her port sight, lingered just slightly longer than necessary, and her eyes held a quality of focused attention that Lora recognized from childhood sessions with craft scissors. "Can you tell me about the pain, Emma?" Lora asked, her voice pitched to the exact frequency that made children want to please adults. "On our scale of 1 to 10, but I want you to be really honest with me. Some kids think they need to be brave, all the time, but I need to know exactly how much it hurts so I can help you better." Emma's response was dutiful, detailed, and delivered with the careful precision of a child who had learned that adults paid attention to her pain in ways that made her uncomfortable, but that she couldn't quite articulate. As Lora made notes, in Emma's chart, her expression held the same focused intensity Lora remembered from moments before the scissors came out. Analytical curiosity paired with something that looked almost like hunger. The recognition hit Lora like a physical blow. Lora hadn't changed. She had simply found a more socially acceptable outlet for her fascination with inflicting and studying pain. The medical setting provided perfect cover, legitimate reasons to ask invasive questions about children's suffering, professional justification for touching vulnerable bodies, and built-in authority that made questioning her methods seem inappropriate or paranoid. Lora's hands shook as she lowered her camera, the weight of realization settling on her shoulders like a familiar scar. She had spent 15 years believing that her childhood abuse was an isolated anomaly, something Lora had grown out of as she matured. But watching her twin sister interact with Emma Patterson, seeing the subtle signs of predatory attention disguised as medical care, Lora understood that Lora hadn't reformed, she had simply evolved. The afternoon brought another encounter that crystallized Lora's growing horror. In the trauma unit, she watched Lora examine a 7-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been brought in after falling from playground equipment. The child was crying softly, more from fear than pain, while his grandmother held his hand and whispered reassurances in Spanish. "Marcus is being such a good patient," Lora told the grandmother, her smile warm and professional. "I need to check his reflexes, which might feel a little strange, but it's very important for making sure he doesn't have any hidden injuries." Her explanation was thorough, medically appropriate, and delivered with exactly the kind of confidence that made family members trust her completely. But Lora's trained eye caught the details that others missed. The way Lora's grip on Marcus's leg was firmer than necessary for a standard neurological exam. How her pressure point testing seemed to focus on areas that would generate maximum discomfort without obvious bruising. The micro-expression of satisfaction that crossed her face when Marcus winced and tried to pull away, only to be gently but firmly held in place, while Lora completed her thorough examination. "You're doing so well, Marcus," Lora murmured, her voice carrying the same tone she had used with child Lora during scissor sessions. "I know it's uncomfortable, but you're being so brave. Some kids your age would be crying a lot more. You must have a really high tolerance for pain." The praise felt like poison wrapped in honey. Lora recognized the manipulation, encouraging children to endure discomfort by framing their suffering as strength, teaching them that their value lay in their ability to absorb pain without complaint. It was the same psychological conditioning Lora had used during their childhood, convincing Lora that her capacity for silent endurance made her special, chosen, worthy of Lora's unique form of attention. Marcus's grandmother beamed with pride at her grandson's stoicism, completely unaware that her child was being groomed to accept increasingly invasive procedures from someone who took professional pleasure in pediatric suffering. The scene was a masterclass in medical gaslighting, using institutional authority and family expectations to normalize inappropriate attention to children's pain responses. Lora left the hospital that day with a memory card full of images and a growing sense of moral obligation that felt heavier than all her camera equipment combined. That evening, she spread the photographs across her dining room table like evidence in a criminal case, which, she was beginning to realize, they might actually become. The images told a story that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't lived. Through Lora's particular brand of cruelty, subtle signs of boundary violation disguised as medical necessity, inappropriate fascination with children's pain responses, the strategic use of professional authority to access vulnerable victims, and threading through it all, the same analytical coldness that Lora remembered from childhood, now refined by medical training and protected by institutional respect. Her phone rang as she studied a photograph of Lora examining Emma Patterson's arm, a close-up that captured the intense focus in Lora's eyes as the child winced from pressure on a tender spot. The caller ID showed Dr. Martinez's office, and Lora answered with the distracted tone of someone whose mind was occupied by darker considerations. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Dr. Martinez. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to follow up on something. You mentioned that your sister is in medical school? Pediatric residency at Children's Hospital, Lora confirmed, still staring at the photograph that seemed to contain entire volumes about the persistence of predatory behavior across professional contexts. I see. And you said she's studying to work with children specifically? The concern in Dr. Martinez's voice was subtle, but unmistakable. He had clearly done his own research, drawn his own conclusions about someone with Lora's psychological profile choosing a career that provided access to vulnerable patients. Yes, she volunteers there too. Very dedicated to working with kids. The silence that followed felt loaded with unspoken implications. Dr. Martinez, with his decades of experience treating victims of violence, understood what Lora was only beginning to comprehend, that childhood abusers rarely reformed. They simply found new outlets and new victims. The medical profession, with its built-in authority and access to vulnerable populations, provided perfect cover for someone whose primary interest in children involved their capacity for suffering. The conference room at Children's Hospital had been transformed into a command center for what would later be called the Mitchell investigation, a case that would fundamentally change how medical institutions screened residents and monitored patient interactions. Detective Chen sat at the head of a table surrounded by Dr. Hendricks, Ms. Morrison from Risk Management, 2 attorneys from the hospital's legal department, a representative from the medical board, and Dr. Martinez, whose expertise in recognizing abuse patterns had become crucial to understanding the scope of Lora's activities. It had been 72 hours since Emma Patterson's parents had confirmed what the security footage suggested. Their daughter had reported strange dreams about the lady doctor with cold hands visiting her room at night, touching her in ways that made her feel scared but that she couldn't quite explain. The 8-year-old's account, delivered in the halting language of childhood trauma, had provided the testimonial evidence needed to move beyond circumstantial concerns toward criminal charges. The pattern is consistent across 17 patients over an 8-month period, Dr. Hendricks reported, consulting a thick folder that documented the full scope of Lora's inappropriate activities: unauthorized after-hours visits, extended examinations that exceeded medical necessity, inappropriate questioning about pain tolerance, and physical contact that multiple children described as making them feel uncomfortable despite Dr. Mitchell's reputation for gentle bedside manner. The number felt staggering to Lora, who sat in the observer's chair reviewing documentation that proved her childhood experiences hadn't been isolated incidents, but practice sessions for a career built around access to vulnerable patients. 17 children whose trust had been exploited, whose medical needs had been used as cover for systematic boundary violations, whose recovery processes had been complicated by encounters with someone who viewed their suffering as research material. Detective Chen pulled up a photograph on the room's large monitor, a security image showing Lora entering the pediatric ward at 11:47 p.m. 3 nights earlier. Dr. Mitchell's explanation for these visits has evolved as we've pressed for details. Initially, she claimed concern for distressed patients. When presented with evidence that most of these patients were sedated or sleeping, she claimed she was conducting pain assessments that couldn't be completed during regular hours due to scheduling constraints. Pain assessments on unconscious children, Dr. Martinez said, his voice carrying the controlled outrage of someone who had dedicated his career to healing rather than harming. The medical justification is nonsensical, but it reveals the sophistication of Dr. Mitchell's rationalization system. She's learned to create pseudo-medical explanations for behavior that serves purely psychological needs. Ms. Morrison opened another folder, this one containing Lora's complete academic and professional record. We've also discovered concerning patterns in Dr. Mitchell's educational history. At Johns Hopkins, she specifically requested assignments in pediatric pain management, volunteered for research projects involving children's responses to medical procedures, and wrote her senior thesis on pain tolerance variations in pediatric populations. The academic trail painted a picture of someone who had used legitimate educational opportunities to study her area of pathological interest, transforming predatory curiosity into scholarly expertise. Lora's thesis, according to the summary, Ms. Morrison read aloud, had involved extensive interviews with children about their experiences with medical pain. Research that now appeared to have served dual purposes as both academic achievement and psychological satisfaction. The most disturbing element, Detective Chen continued, is the sophistication of Dr. Mitchell's victim selection process. She consistently targeted children who were already experiencing significant medical trauma, cancer patients, accident victims, children with chronic pain conditions. These patients were less likely to report additional discomfort because they were already dealing with legitimate medical issues that caused ongoing pain. Lora recognized the strategy immediately. It was identical to Lora's childhood pattern of attacking when Lora was already vulnerable, during illness, after disappointments, when their parents were distracted by other concerns. Lora had always understood that victims who were already suffering were less likely to be believed when they reported additional harm, especially when that harm came disguised as care. The legal representative, a stern woman named Patricia Wells, reviewed the charges that were being prepared. We're looking at multiple counts of patient abuse, unauthorized access to medical facilities, fraud related to falsified medical records, and potential federal charges related to the exploitation of minors in a healthcare setting. The district attorney's office is treating this as a pattern case rather than isolated incidents. But even as the legal machinery moved into action, Lora felt the familiar anxiety that had defined her relationship with Lora's consequences. Throughout their childhood, their parents had always found ways to minimize Lora's actions, to reframe criminal behavior as character flaws that could be addressed through understanding rather than punishment. Lora herself had perfected the art of generating sympathy for her own struggles, while deflecting attention from her victim's suffering. "What about her current patients?" Lora asked, thinking of the children who had grown attached to the caring doctor who remembered their names, brought them small gifts, and showed such unusual interest in their experiences with pain and medical procedures. Dr. Hendrick's expression reflected the complexity of untangling a predator's professional relationships. "We've had to reassign 17 children to other residents, which has created additional trauma for patients who were already dealing with serious medical issues. Many families are struggling to understand why someone they trusted with their children's care is suddenly unavailable and potentially dangerous. The secondary trauma was heartbreaking but necessary. Children forced to navigate new medical relationships while processing the betrayal of someone who had used their vulnerability for predatory purposes. Several families had requested psychological support for their children who were displaying symptoms of medical anxiety and trust issues that would complicate their ongoing treatment. Emma Patterson's parents are considering legal action," Ms. Morrison reported. "They're working with advocates who specialize in medical abuse cases, but they're also dealing with Emma's confusion about why her favorite doctor can't visit her anymore." The 8-year-old's attachment to Lora was particularly disturbing because it revealed how effectively predators could disguise exploitation as special attention. Emma had felt chosen, valued, important when Lora spent extra time with her. Feelings that were now tainted by the understanding that her suffering had been the real source of Lora's interest. Detective Chen's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression shifting toward something that might have been satisfaction mixed with concern. Dr. Mitchell has been arrested at her apartment. She wasn't cooperative during questioning, but she did make some interesting statements that suggest she views her activities as legitimate medical research rather than patient abuse. The disconnect was chilling, but familiar. Lora's ability to rationalize predatory behavior as beneficial, to transform victim exploitation into professional development, to maintain belief in her own benevolent intentions, even when confronted with evidence of systematic harm. It was the same psychological mechanism that had allowed her to comfort child Lora after scissor attacks while planning the next experimental session. Did she admit to the unauthorized visits? Dr. Hendricks asked, though her tone suggested she expected Lora's responses to be carefully crafted to minimize legal exposure while maintaining professional credibility. She characterized them as enhanced patient monitoring and claimed she was developing innovative approaches to pediatric pain management that would ultimately benefit the children involved, Detective Chen replied. She also suggested that complaints about her methods stemmed from colleagues' jealousy of her rapport with young patients and her willingness to go above and beyond standard care protocols. The familiar pattern of Lora's self-justification was perfectly intact, reframing predation as innovation, exploitation as dedication, and victims' distress as evidence of their special relationship with someone who understood their needs better than standard medical protocols allowed. She had learned to use the language of medical advancement to disguise psychological pathology, creating narratives that made her activities sound pioneering rather than predatory. Dr. Martinez pulled up the folder containing Lora's childhood, medical records, documents that had been subpoenaed as part of the investigation into Lora's history of harmful behavior. The parallels between Dr. Mitchell's current activities and her childhood patterns are striking. The systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals, the use of legitimate authority to access victims, the creation of explanatory narratives that make abuse seem beneficial. These behaviors have been consistent for over 20 years. The timeline revealed a disturbing evolution from childhood experimentation to professional exploitation, with medical school providing the knowledge and credentials needed to refine techniques that had been developed during sessions with craft. Scissors in a shared bedroom. Lora had spent 2 decades perfecting her ability to inflict harm while maintaining the appearance of care, using each educational opportunity to enhance her understanding of how to exploit vulnerability more effectively. What's particularly concerning, Dr. Martinez continued, is that Dr. Mitchell's academic achievements and professional recommendations suggest she's been planning this career trajectory for years. Her choice of pediatric medicine wasn't motivated by a desire to heal children. It was motivated by access to the patient population that most closely resembled her preferred victims. The realization hit the room like a collective held breath released. Lora's entire medical career had been an elaborate scheme to institutionalize her pathological interests, using the respect accorded to pediatric specialists to continue the systematic exploitation she had begun with her twin sister. The white coat and stethoscope were sophisticated versions of the yellow-handled scissors, tools that provided access to vulnerable bodies while protecting the wielder from suspicion. Ms. Morrison pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the State Medical Board. Dr. Mitchell's medical license has been suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. We're also conducting a comprehensive review of her medical school training, residency performance, and any patients who may have been affected by her inappropriate activities. But the administrative response felt insufficient compared to the scope of Lora's manipulation. Lora thought about all the recommendation letters Lora had received, the awards for compassionate patient care, the family testimonials praising her dedication to children's well-being. How many adults had Lora charmed into providing professional credibility for activities that were fundamentally predatory? Detective Chen opened another folder, this one containing victim statements from children and families who had been affected by Lora's activities. We've identified 23 potential victims across her medical training period, though many families are reluctant to come forward due to concerns about their children's ongoing medical needs and the trauma of legal proceedings. The number continued to grow as investigators dug deeper into Lora's professional history, revealing a pattern of boundary violations that extended back through her clinical rotations and into her volunteer work at children's hospitals during medical school. Each new victim represented years of sophisticated manipulation, professional gaslighting, and the exploitation of medical authority to access vulnerable children. "The good news," Dr. Hendricks said, though her expression suggested the term was relative, "is that Dr. Mitchell's arrest has prompted other medical institutions to review their monitoring protocols for residents and attending physicians. Children's hospitals across the country are implementing enhanced supervision procedures and mandatory reporting systems for unusual patient interactions." The policy changes felt like victories measured in prevention rather than justice. Future children who would be protected by safeguards that Lora's victims hadn't had access to. Institutional reforms that acknowledged the possibility of predators hiding behind medical credentials. But for the children who had already been affected, policy changes couldn't undo the trust that had been violated, or the medical anxiety that would complicate their ongoing treatment. Lora's phone buzzed with a text from their mother. "I still can't believe this is happening. Lora's lawyer says you've destroyed her life with these accusations. She's talking about medical school debt and ruined career prospects. Why couldn't you have worked this out privately?" The message crystallized everything that was wrong. With their family's dynamic, even facing criminal charges and documented evidence of systematic patient abuse, Lora was still positioned as the victim of her twin sister's vindictive behavior. Their mother's concern focused on Lora's career prospects, rather than the children she had exploited, her financial debt, rather than the psychological damage she had inflicted on vulnerable patients. Detective Chen noticed Lora's expression and leaned forward with the concerned attention of someone who understood that family dynamics could be as toxic as any institutional failure. "How are you handling the family pressure? We've seen cases where family members try to convince victims to recant their statements or minimize their cooperation with investigations." "They want me to feel guilty for destroying Lora's future," Lora replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I keep thinking about Emma Patterson and all the other children who trusted someone who was using their pain for personal satisfaction. Their healing is more important than Lora's career." The shift in perspective felt monumental, from focusing on her own trauma and healing to accepting responsibility for protecting others from experiencing similar harm. The 47 scars on her body had become evidence in a case that extended far beyond personal recovery. Documentation that could prevent future children from acquiring their own constellations of abuse. Dr. Martinez reached across the table and handed Lora a folder containing letters from medical professionals across the country who had read about the case and recognized similar patterns in their own institutions. "Your courage in coming forward has already saved children in other hospitals. Medical professionals are reporting concerns they previously dismissed, investigating behaviors they had rationalized as professional thoroughness." The letters were from pediatric nurses who had felt uncomfortable with certain doctors-patient interactions, but hadn't known how to report vague concerns about boundary violations. From attending physicians who had noticed residents spending excessive time with specific patient populations but had attributed it to dedication rather than predation. From hospital administrators who were implementing new protocols based on the warning signs that Lora's case had revealed. "The ripple effects are already visible," Dr. Hendricks added, pulling up emails from colleagues at other medical institutions. Training programs are revising their screening procedures for residents interested in pediatric specialties. Hospitals are implementing buddy systems for after-hours patient care. Medical schools are adding ethics components specifically focused on recognizing and preventing predatory behavior in healthcare settings. The systemic changes felt like Lora's true legacy. Not the academic achievements or professional recognition she had accumulated, but the institutional reforms that her exposure had necessitated. Children's hospitals were becoming safer because Other medical professionals now understood that predators could hide behind the most respected careers, using societal trust in healthcare workers to access and exploit vulnerable populations. As the meeting concluded, Lora felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity that reminded her of completing a difficult photography project, the simultaneous relief of finishing something important, and the recognition that the work had changed her permanently. She was no longer just Lora's victim or a survivor seeking personal healing. She had become an advocate whose experience could protect others, a witness whose testimony had institutional impact beyond her individual recovery. Walking out of the hospital into Seattle's evening drizzle, Lora realized that the investigation had achieved something her years of therapy and documentation couldn't accomplish alone. It had transformed her story from private trauma into public protection. The scars that had marked her as damaged goods in her family's narrative had become evidence that could save children from acquiring similar wounds. Her phone rang as she reached her car. Detective Chen calling with an update that would either close this chapter or open new complications in a case that had already expanded beyond anything Lora could have imagined when she first contacted Dr. Martinez about reconstructive surgery options. "Lora, we've got a problem," Detective Chen said, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had learned that predators rarely went quietly into institutional consequences. Dr. Mitchell made bail this afternoon, and her first call wasn't to her lawyer or her parents. It was to Children's Hospital, asking about visiting restrictions for former residents. "We think she's planning something." The familiar fear crept back into Lora's chest, but this time it was tempered by a different kind of understanding. She was no longer an isolated child, hiding scissors wounds from adults who refused to see them. She was part of a network of professionals who recognized Lora's danger and were committed to preventing her from accessing new victims. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in 22 years, Lora wasn't fighting it alone. The courtroom felt smaller than Lora had expected, its wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere more bureaucratic than dramatic. She sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, watching Lora's defense attorney present arguments that felt depressingly familiar. Mental health challenges, childhood trauma, professional stress, anything that could transform systematic predation into unfortunate circumstances deserving of treatment rather than punishment. Lora herself sat perfectly composed at the defendant's table, wearing a conservative navy suit that projected professional competence despite the orange jumpsuit she'd returned to her cell in each evening for the past 90 days. Her posture remained straight, her expression appropriately remorseful, her occasional glances toward the gallery carrying just the right mixture of pain and hope. She had learned to perform contrition as skillfully as she had once performed medical compassion. The prosecutor, Maria Santos, was methodically presenting evidence that painted a picture of calculated exploitation spanning multiple institutions and dozens of victims. Photographs from Lora's surveillance, security footage from unauthorized hospital visits, victim statements from children and families who had been manipulated into trusting someone whose primary interest lay in their capacity for suffering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Santos said, her voice carrying the controlled passion of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable populations. "This case isn't about a medical professional who made poor judgment calls under stress. This is about someone who spent 20 years perfecting techniques for exploiting childhood vulnerability, using medical credentials to access victims and institutional authority to avoid accountability." Emma Patterson's mother took the witness stand that afternoon, her testimony delivered in the halting voice of someone who was still processing the betrayal of trust that had complicated her daughter's cancer treatment. "Emma keeps asking when Dr. Mitchell is coming back," she said, tears streaming down her face. She doesn't understand why someone who was so kind to her, who remembered her favorite colors and brought her stickers, was actually hurting her in ways we didn't even recognize. The 8-year-old's confusion crystallized the most disturbing aspect of Lora's predation. her ability to make exploitation feel like special attention, to transform boundary violations into evidence, of caring that her victims would remember fondly, even after understanding the true nature of those encounters. Emma would spend years in therapy, learning to distinguish between appropriate medical care and the sophisticated manipulation she had experienced from someone who had studied her responses to pain with clinical fascination. Dr. Hendricks testified about the institutional changes that Lora's case had prompted, describing new protocols for monitoring resident-patient interactions and mandatory reporting systems for concerning behaviors that had previously been dismissed as professional dedication. Dr. Mitchell's activities forced us to confront the possibility that predators could use medical training to refine their techniques rather than redirect their interests toward healing, she explained to the jury. But the defense's strategy became clear as Lora's attorney called character witnesses who described a dedicated medical student whose childhood experiences with family dysfunction had created empathy for suffering children. Teachers from medical school praised her academic achievements. Volunteer coordinators from children's hospitals testified about her exceptional rapport with young patients. Even some families from her residency spoke about feeling grateful for the extra attention she had shown their children during difficult medical procedures. My client suffers from complex trauma stemming from a dysfunctional family environment, Lora's attorney argued during closing statements. Her intense focus on pediatric pain management represents an attempt to heal others from the kind of suffering she experienced herself. These activities, while perhaps exceeding standard protocols, were motivated by genuine desire to help rather than intent to harm. The narrative was seductive in its simplicity. Childhood victim becomes adult healer, professional dedication misinterpreted as predatory behavior, family dynamics so toxic that even attempts at justice become additional forms of abuse. Lora recognized the familiar inversion of reality that had defined their relationship since childhood. Lora's ability to position herself as the victim even when confronted with evidence of systematic harm she had inflicted on others. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with verdicts that felt both victorious and insufficient. Guilty on 12 counts of patient abuse, 3 counts of fraudulent medical practice, and 2 federal charges related to exploitation of minors in healthcare settings. But the sentences would run concurrently, meaning Lora would serve 18 months in minimum security prison before becoming eligible for parole and supervised return to society. 18 months for 20 years of predatory behavior. Supervised release that would allow her to rebuild her life while her victims continued processing trauma that would affect their relationship with medical care for decades. The mathematics of justice felt fundamentally broken, but Prosecutor Santos assured Lora that the conviction itself would prevent Lora from working in healthcare and would serve as precedent for similar cases involving medical predators. As Lora was led away in handcuffs, she turned toward the gallery with an expression that managed to convey both defeat and promise. A look that said this chapter was ending, but the story itself was far from over. Her eyes found Lora's across the courtroom, and for a moment, the 22 years since their last shared bedroom collapsed into instant recognition of someone who understood exactly how creative revenge could become when given sufficient time and motivation. 6 months later, Lora's photography studio had been transformed into headquarters for the Mitchell Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training healthcare workers to recognize signs of predatory behavior disguised as medical care. The walls that had once displayed her artistic work now showed educational materials, warning signs of inappropriate patient interactions, protocols for reporting concerning behaviors, and testimonials from medical professionals who had learned to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Dr. Martinez served as the Foundation's medical advisor, reviewing cases from hospitals across the country where staff members had identified potential predators before they could establish extensive victim patterns. The referrals came from nurses who noticed unusual resident behaviors, attending physicians who felt uncomfortable with colleagues' patient interaction styles, and family members who trusted their children's reports of medical encounters that made them feel unsafe. "We've prevented 3 potential cases this month alone," Dr. Martinez reported during the Foundation's weekly meeting. A pediatric surgeon in Portland whose after-hours activities raised concerns among nursing staff. A medical student in Phoenix who was asking unusual questions about children's pain tolerance during clinical rotations, and a volunteer at a children's hospital in Miami whose interaction style made several families uncomfortable. Each prevented case represented dozens of children who would never experience the systematic exploitation that Emma Patterson and Lora's other victims had endured. The Foundation's work felt like preventive medicine applied to institutional settings, identifying pathological behaviors before they could establish patterns, providing education that helped medical professionals recognize predatory interests, disguised as clinical expertise. Emma Patterson herself had become an unlikely advocate for the Foundation's work, her 8-year-old perspective offering insights that adult professionals sometimes missed. "Kids know when something feels wrong," she told audiences at medical conferences, where Lora presented the Foundation's training materials. "But we need grown-ups to believe us and not think we're just being difficult about medical procedures." The child's wisdom was profound in its simplicity. Children's instinctive responses to inappropriate attention were often dismissed as medical anxiety or age-appropriate difficulty with healthcare procedures. Training programs now emphasized listening to patients' reports of discomfort that extended beyond physical pain, recognizing that children's emotional responses to medical encounters could indicate boundary violations that adults might not detect. 1 year later, the letter arrived. On a Tuesday morning, delivered by registered mail to ensure Lora would receive it personally. The return address showed the state correctional facility where Lora was serving her sentence, and the envelope felt heavier than the single sheet of paper it contained could account for. Lora stared at it for several minutes before opening it, recognizing her twin sister's precise handwriting, even through the institutional ballpoint pen that had replaced her expensive medical instruments. "Dear sister," the letter began, the familiar term of endearment feeling like a blade carefully concealed in loving language. "I've had considerable time to reflect on recent events and the ways my professional activities were misunderstood by people who couldn't appreciate the innovative approaches I was developing for pediatric pain management. I want you to know that I harbor no resentment toward you for the difficulties these misunderstandings have created." The letter continued for 2 pages, describing Lora's participation in prison therapy programs, her plans for rebuilding her life after release, and her continued belief that her medical activities had been misinterpreted by professionals who lacked her unique insight into children's psychological needs. Not once did she acknowledge harm to her victims or accept responsibility for exploiting vulnerable patients. "I understand that you've created some kind of foundation based on your interpretation of my work," Lora wrote in the letter's final paragraph. "I hope that when I'm released, we can collaborate on educational programs that benefit children, rather than working at cross purposes. After all, we're twins. We understand each other in ways that others never could. I look forward to our reunion." The heart emoji, written in careful cursive, felt like a promise rather than affection. Lora was telling her that imprisonment had been an interruption rather than a conclusion, that their relationship would resume upon her release, and that the Foundation's work represented territory she intended to reclaim rather than competition she would tolerate. Lora shared the letter with Detective Chen, who had remained involved in monitoring Lora's case even after the conviction. "She's eligible for parole in 6 months, the detective explained, reviewing Lora's prison records. "Her behavior has been exemplary. She's completed all required therapy programs, and she's expressed what counselors describe as appropriate remorse for her actions." But Dr. Martinez, reviewing psychological evaluations from Lora's therapy sessions, identified concerning patterns in her responses to treatment. "She's learned to provide the answers that demonstrate rehabilitation while maintaining core beliefs about her activities being misunderstood rather than harmful," he explained to Lora and Detective Chen. The language suggests compliance with therapeutic expectations, rather than genuine recognition of the damage she inflicted. The distinction was crucial. Lora had spent 12 months learning to perform rehabilitation as skillfully as she had once performed medical compassion, studying her therapist's expectations and providing responses that would support her parole applications while preserving her fundamental understanding of herself as someone whose activities had been beneficial rather than predatory. 18. Months later, the notification arrived through official channels. Lora had been released on parole with restrictions that prohibited her from working in healthcare, volunteering with children's organizations, or having unsupervised contact with minors. She was required to attend weekly therapy sessions, submit to regular psychological evaluations, and maintain employment in a field that didn't involve vulnerable populations. Within a week, Lora received reports that Lora had enrolled in a social work program at a local community college, claiming interest in helping troubled families navigate social services systems. The career change felt ominous rather than reassuring. Social work would provide different but equally effective access to vulnerable children, along with institutional authority that could be used to identify families in crisis whose circumstances might make them less likely to question inappropriate attention. Detective Chen coordinated with parole officers to monitor Lora's activities, but the restrictions felt inadequate compared to someone whose predatory interests had been refined. Through 2 decades of practice and professional training, Lora understood legal boundaries well enough to operate within them while satisfying psychological needs that had nothing to do with rehabilitation or reformation. 2 years later, Emma Patterson, now 10 years old and in full remission from her cancer, spoke at the Mitchell Foundation's annual conference about the importance of believing children when they reported feeling unsafe during medical encounters. Her family had become advocates for enhanced patient protection protocols, working with hospitals to implement systems that made it easier for young patients to report concerns about their medical care. Dr. Mitchell taught me that some people who seem really nice might not be safe, Emma told an audience of medical professionals, her voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to distinguish between appropriate care and sophisticated manipulation. But she also taught me that when kids tell grown-ups something feels wrong, it's important to listen to us even if the person seems really good at their job. The child's testimony was followed by presentations from nurses, doctors, and hospital administrators who had used the Foundation's training materials to identify and address concerning behaviors before they could escalate into systematic abuse. The prevention approach was working. Potential predators were being identified during training periods rather than after they had established victim patterns. Institutional cultures were shifting toward transparency rather than protecting professional reputations. But the Foundation's success felt fragile compared to the persistence of the problems they were addressing. For every potential predator identified through enhanced screening, others were learning to better disguise their intentions, adapting to new protocols and finding innovative ways to access vulnerable populations. 3 years later, the phone call came at 2:17 a.m., Detective Chen's voice carrying the urgency of someone who had been hoping this conversation would never be necessary. Lora. Lora violated her parole restrictions. She was found at a children's shelter where she'd been volunteering under an assumed name. The social work program was apparently legitimate, but she was using it to gain access to at-risk children, who were less likely to report inappropriate attention. The pattern had resumed with sophistication that suggested Lora's time in prison had been spent planning rather than reforming. She had researched organizational structures that provided access to vulnerable children, studied legal restrictions to understand how to circumvent them, and created false credentials that allowed her to work with exactly the population her parole was designed to protect. "How many children?" Lora asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "We're still investigating, but preliminary interviews suggest she'd been working at the shelter for 4 months under the name Dr. Sarah Mitchell, close enough to her real identity to feel comfortable but different enough to avoid detection, through standard background checks. The children describe her as unusually interested in their experiences with abuse and trauma. The revelation felt like watching a familiar nightmare replay in higher definition. Lora had used her understanding of child psychology to target victims who were already experiencing trauma, whose reports of additional inappropriate attention would be dismissed as symptoms of existing emotional disturbance. She had found the most vulnerable children in the most protective environment and systematically exploited the very trust that institutions had worked to rebuild. 5 years later, Lora's second conviction carried more serious consequences. 8 years in maximum security prison, lifetime registration as a sex offender, and permanent prohibition from working in any capacity that involved contact with children. But even from prison, her influence continued through letters to former colleagues, social media accounts managed by supporters, and a growing online community of people who viewed her as a victim of institutional bias against innovative medical approaches. The narrative of Lora as misunderstood pioneer had taken root among certain medical professionals who saw her case as evidence of overcorrection in patient protection protocols. They argued that enhanced supervision was creating environments where dedicated healthcare workers were afraid to show genuine concern for their patients' well-being, that fear of accusations was preventing the kind of innovative approaches that could advance pediatric medicine. Lora found herself fighting battles on multiple fronts, protecting the Foundation's work from critics who viewed their training programs as unnecessary paranoia, documenting new cases of medical predation that proved the ongoing need for enhanced vigilance, and managing her own psychological responses to Lora's continued ability to manipulate narratives even from behind bars. 10 years later, the Mitchell Foundation had grown from Lora's converted studio into a national organization with offices in 12 cities and training programs implemented in over 300 medical institutions. The organization's success could be measured in prevention statistics, documented cases of potential predators identified before they could establish victim patterns, children protected through enhanced screening procedures, families educated, to recognize warning signs of inappropriate medical attention. Emma Patterson, now 20 and studying child psychology herself, served on the Foundation's board of directors, her perspective as both victim and advocate providing crucial insights into long-term healing processes. She had grown into someone whose experience with predation had been transformed into expertise in protection, her childhood encounter with Lora becoming the foundation for a career dedicated to preventing others from experiencing similar exploitation, the FI. Most important thing we've learned, Emma told audiences at medical conferences, is that healing isn't just about recovering from trauma. It's about using our experience to create safety for others. My encounter with Dr. Mitchell was devastating, but the work that came from exposing her activities has protected hundreds of children from experiencing what I went through. Dr. Martinez, now in his 70s, had dedicated his remaining career to training other medical professionals to recognize signs of predatory behavior disguised as professional dedication. His collaboration with the Foundation had produced screening protocols now used in medical schools across the country, educational materials that helped identify potential problems before they could evolve into systematic abuse. The Lora Mitchell case taught us that predators can spend decades perfecting their techniques, using legitimate educational and professional opportunities to refine their understanding of how to exploit vulnerable populations, he explained during his keynote address at the Foundation's 10th anniversary conference. But it also demonstrated that survivors' voices, when supported by institutional commitment to protection, can create changes that prevent future victimization on a massive scale. 15 years later, the letter arrived on the anniversary of Lora's first conviction, delivered to the Foundation's headquarters with the same registered mail formality that had marked their correspondence throughout her incarceration. This time, the return address showed a different correctional facility, maximum security, where Lora was serving her extended sentence for the children's shelter violations. "Dear Sister," the letter began, the familiar greeting now carrying 15 years of accumulated menace. I've been following the Foundation's work through news reports and online publications. It's remarkable how our shared childhood experiences have been transformed into what appears to be a successful enterprise. I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even if your interpretation of our family history differs from my own understanding of those events. The letter described Lora's continuing education in psychology and social work, advanced degrees earned through correspondence programs that she claimed would prepare her for meaningful contribution to society upon her eventual release. She had spent 15 years studying institutional systems, legal frameworks, and technological innovations that would provide new opportunities for accessing vulnerable populations. I've been particularly interested in developments in telemedicine and online therapeutic services, Lora wrote in the letter's most chilling passage. The digital revolution has created fascinating opportunities for connecting with young people who might not have access to traditional support systems. When I'm released, I look forward to exploring these innovations in ways that could benefit children across geographic and economic boundaries. The implication was unmistakable. Lora was preparing for a future where physical proximity would be unnecessary for exploitation, where internet access could provide entry into children's lives without the institutional oversight that had eventually exposed her hospital activities. She had spent her incarceration studying new frontiers of predation rather than accepting responsibility for past harm. Detective Chen, now retired but still monitoring Lora's case, reviewed the letter with the weary expertise of someone who had spent her career understanding that some patterns of behavior were too deeply ingrained to be changed through punishment or treatment. She's eligible for parole again in 5 years, she explained to Lora. The psychological evaluations continue to show what they describe as progress, but the language in these letters suggests she's learning to better disguise her intentions rather than redirect them. 20 years later, Emma Patterson published her doctoral dissertation on long-term recovery from medical trauma, a comprehensive study that had grown from her own experience into research that would guide treatment approaches for decades. The dissertation acknowledged her childhood encounter with Lora as the catalyst for her career, but focused on the healing processes that had transformed early trauma into professional expertise. Victims of medical predation face unique challenges. In recovery, she wrote in the study's conclusion, because the very institutions designed to provide healing become sources of ongoing anxiety and mistrust. However, our research demonstrates that survivors who transform their experience into advocacy for systemic change report higher levels of psychological well-being and sense of purpose than those who focus solely on individual recovery. The finding suggested that Lora's decision to create the foundation had been not just altruistic but therapeutic, that her work protecting other children had provided healing that individual therapy alone could never have achieved. The scars that had marked her as damaged in her family's narrative had become evidence that created safety for countless others. The Foundation's work had evolved beyond its original focus on medical settings to address predatory behavior in schools. Sports programs, religious organizations, and online environments where adults gained access to vulnerable children. Lora's case had provided a template for understanding how predators used institutional authority to avoid detection, lessons that applied across multiple settings where children's trust could be systematically exploited. 25 years later, the notification arrived through official legal channels rather than personal correspondence. Lora had died in prison from complications related to a rare autoimmune condition that had developed during her incarceration. She was 54 years old, having spent the final 22 years of her life in various correctional facilities, never again having direct access to the vulnerable children whose suffering had provided her primary source of psychological satisfaction. Lora's reaction to the news surprised her with its complexity. Relief that Lora would never again be able to harm children, but also a strange, "My twin stabbed me with scissors," parents said, "sibling rivalry." The plastic surgeon found 47 wounds 25 years later. Lora's reaction to the news surprised her with its complexity. Relief that Lora would never again be able to harm children, but also a strange emptiness where decades of hypervigilance had lived. The twin sister who had shaped every aspect of her adult life, from her choice of career to her commitment to child protection, was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt both peaceful and unsettling. The memorial service was small, attended primarily by their parents, a handful of distant relatives, and Lora's former defense attorney. Lora sat in the back row, observing the careful language used to describe someone whose life had been defined by systematic harm disguised as care. The eulogy spoke of Lora's struggles with mental health and her complicated relationship with helping others, euphemisms that even in death continued the pattern of minimizing predatory behavior. Their mother approached Lora after the service, her expression carrying the familiar mixture of grief and accusation that had defined their family dynamic for decades. "She could have been a great doctor," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of lost possibilities. If things had been different, she could have helped so many children." The inversion of reality remained intact even at Lora's graveside. The predator transformed into potential savior, the systematic abuse reframed as misunderstood healing, the victim positioned as the architect of her sister's destruction. Lora realized that some narratives were too deeply embedded to be changed by evidence, consequences, or even death itself. But walking away from the cemetery, Lora felt something she hadn't experienced in 25 years. Freedom from the constant awareness of Lora's presence in the world. The hypervigilance that had driven her foundation work could finally evolve into something less urgent, less personal, more focused on prevention than protection from a specific threat. Dr. Martinez, now 82 and officially retired but still consulting on complex cases, met Lora for coffee the following week. They sat in the same Seattle cafe where they had first discussed expanding her case documentation into systematic advocacy, watching afternoon rain create abstract patterns on windows that had witnessed countless conversations about healing and harm. "How do you feel about closing this chapter?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle curiosity of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate the aftermath of profound trauma. Lora considered the question while watching strangers navigate their own complicated lives beyond the cafe windows. "I keep thinking about Emma," she said finally. "She's building a career around preventing what happened to both of us. The work continues, even though the person who started it is gone." Emma Patterson had indeed transformed her childhood encounter with Lora into a life dedicated to protecting other children from similar exploitation. Now Dr. Emma Patterson, she ran training programs across the country, teaching medical professionals, teachers, and parents to recognize signs of predatory behavior disguised as special attention or professional dedication. The Mitchell Foundation had evolved beyond its original mission to become a comprehensive resource for identifying and preventing institutional abuse. The organization now worked with schools, sports programs, religious institutions, and online platforms to create environments where children's reports of inappropriate attention were taken seriously, where adults' unusual interest in accessing vulnerable populations raised immediate red flags. "We've documented over 2,000 cases where potential predators were identified and removed before they could establish victim patterns," Lora told Dr. Martinez, pulling out her phone to show statistics that represented thousands of children who would never experience the systematic exploitation she had endured. "The screening protocols we developed after Lora's case are now standard practice in pediatric hospitals across North America." The numbers felt both significant and insufficient, impressive evidence of systematic change coupled with the knowledge that predatory behavior adapted to new circumstances, found innovative ways to circumvent enhanced protections, evolved alongside the very systems designed to prevent it. "Lora's death doesn't end the work," Dr. Martinez observed, stirring sugar into his coffee with the methodical precision of someone who understood that healing was measured in decades rather than moments. But it might allow you to engage with it from a different psychological space. Less reactive, more proactive. 3 months after Lora's death, Lora received a package with no return address. Lora's personal effects from the correctional facility, forwarded through legal channels. Among the standard items was a journal containing detailed observations about institutional systems, notes about online access to vulnerable populations, and sketches that suggested Lora had spent her final years planning activities that would never now come to fruition. The journal's final entry was dated 2 weeks before Lora's death. The digital age offers opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined. Physical proximity is no longer necessary for establishing the kind of connections that provide meaningful insights into children's psychological development. When I'm released, the real work can finally begin. Lora closed the journal and placed it in the Foundation's archives, evidence of how predatory interests persisted regardless of consequences or confinement. Lora's death had ended her individual threat, but the psychological patterns she represented continued to manifest in others who viewed vulnerable children as subjects for their own twisted research rather than human beings deserving protection and care. The fight would continue, but for the first time in 25 years, Lora could engage with it from a place of strength rather than fear, purpose rather than survival, hope rather than hypervigilance. Lora's legacy would be the institutional changes that protected future children, while her death marked the end of one survivor's journey from victim to advocate to victor. The 47 scars on Lora's body had become evidence that changed the world. If this story moved you, resonated with you, or opened your eyes to the complex realities of childhood trauma and institutional abuse, please consider subscribing to our channel.